Welcome to the RSP cast, Matt Waldman. It's reunion week. Got Dwain McFarland joining us week before the NFL draft. Do a little film and data, or data and film, however you want to look at it, peanut butter and jelly. Dwain, thanks so much for coming back on the show. It's always great to have you on.
Peanut butter and jelly, as long as it's not like peanut butter and avocados, I mean, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah,
Yeah, man,
exactly.
it's always good to be back on. Anytime I'm on with you is always great. I love getting together with people that know the film and trying to look at the data with that, whether that's you or Jay Moyer or some of the other folks. Obviously, you and I, like we've got a long track record together, so looking forward to it.
Sure, absolutely. Now, of course, you can find Dwain McFarland at Pro Football Focus. Find him on Twitter at Dwain McFarland. We're going to talk about receivers and backs today. Probably going to lead in with players where the data doesn't quite match maybe what I'm seeing on film, and we can talk about some of those differences, because what that may explain is there's a specific fit that might really work for that player, or there's things that maybe that the film might be missing, or things that the data doesn't show in a certain context. We'll talk about all three of those possibilities. First, I do want to just point out, this is something that I've been talking about on a lot of podcasts, and I've certainly talked about it here in the past, and that's the GoFundMe that I have been sharing about John Hodgins, and he is really almost 90% of the way there. You can see it right here. I'll put a link to the show also in the podcast notes. But John is a 75-year-old man who spent nearly 25 years working at a hospital, who basically was a victim of a home invasion, he and his wife. And for the past 3 years, he's been trying to get his life back together, been really in and out of a state of homelessness, which is basically being homeless. And we've been able to get very close to his goal. So I'm hoping we can get him maybe over the top before the draft. That would be pretty nice. I know that he's very grateful for the opportunity to be able to do that, get this money so that he can move back closer to his adult daughter who's suffering from mental illness. He's dealing with kidney disease. Get he and his wife and his daughter in kind of a base where that they can settle in and get their life in an order where things aren't just perpetually kind of falling apart, which often happens when you're in a financial state like this. And so we appreciate your response. If you've been if you can just share it, if that's all you can do, that's enough. You might be able to put it in front of the eyes of somebody who will be able to make a donation or help out in some other way and be able to contact John. So, all that's, something that I just wanted to bring up, and appreciate those of you that have donated. And at this point, let's go ahead and talk a little shop, Dwain. One of the things that we'll do is let's bring up these wide receivers. And I think, the cool thing about what we have here from Dwain, in terms of looking at the data, is that he's got tiers with his players, and he's got 5 players in his first tier, which are Garrett Wilson, Treylon Burks, Jameson Williams, Drake London, Chris Olave, and then he has tier 2. It looks like we have 7 players, which includes Sky Moore, George Pickens, Jahan Dotson, Christian Watson, John Metchy, Wan'Dale Robinson, and David Bell. And then there's 3 in tier 3, and Justyn Ross, Khalil Shakir, Jalen Tolbert. And tier 4 has Alec Pierce, Calvin Austin, Romeo Dubs, Kevin Austin Jr. And tier 5, Kyle Phillips, Javon Hiley, the Coastal Carolina wonder.
And honestly, you can just delete tier 5. Like, there's so many below that. Like, a bunch of guys, I just stopped. I was like, just because like the model was just showing such low odds of like them ever hitting, unless like draft capital changes. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll end with,
I would say the top 4 are good. And just to give folks a little bit of idea how this works. So what I did is I've really gone back and looked, and there is a fantasy bend on this. So looking at players and their production over the first 3 years in the NFL, and what are the traits that most strongly correlated from what they did in college over to what would happen in the NFL. So there's several things there. There's their production, and then there is their measurables. But honestly, on receivers, like measurables they hardly matter at all. Like the 40-yard dash, I look for a threshold, but other than that, I really don't care. Like it doesn't correlate. It doesn't show any real strength of signal. So it's mostly about player age, when they're coming out. It's about where we think their expected draft capital is going to go. And for this, I've used grinding the mocks. I actually updated it just before the show. So these are the latest projected mock positions based on the experts across the industry. Grinding the mocks is kind of a mix. But what's funny is historically looking back some of these mocks, I didn't realize like how accurate they are whenever you aggregate them. And so they're usually pretty tight. So expected draft capital is the largest driver to this model right now. And then college production is next. Then rookie age would be after that. And then there are some new things that I've added that we have over at Pro Football Focus that you don't always find everywhere else. And that's being able to actually look at some of their more efficiency metrics. So I've got career yards per route run, and then I've got their career explosive target rate. So explosive targets would be receptions of 15 yards or more. So kind of giving you a hint, trying to give some context to like, how these players may, play a little different, right? You don't necessarily have to be hyper explosive to really work in the model, but it's definitely an added benefit if you can hit all areas of the field.
Beautiful. So let's talk about Treylon Burks and get this one right off the bat, because Treylon Burks, this is a good example of a guy where the difference in terms of where he's ranked by, I think, looking at this as well as what we see a lot of other places and where I have him. And again, this is why I like, for score, Treylon Burks to me is still a guy who can contribute and be in a starting lineup early in his career. That's my score still reflects that. I just happen to think that when I'm looking at players across a spectrum of potential wide receivers and where they could fit, not specific to a team, there are a lot more players who I think have more appeal to a wider range of systems, whereas Burks may need a specific appeal. Now, the thing is that we should probably trust, Dwain, that there's going to be a team that will find a way to make it work with Treylon Burks and will value him highly enough that they will work Burks correctly into what he can do within their offense, and maybe even grow from there.
Yeah, and I think everything you're hitting on there is actually, so there's another article that I actually did. I need to republish it because I probably did it too early in the season. There were quite a few people that reached out. They really liked it. But what I did is I went and I looked at the routes that the NFL uses the most. And so essentially you've got 7 different routes that every team uses at least 7.5% of the time. And so if you look at it as a league average over the last 3 years, these routes alone make up 65% of really the route tree for NFL teams. And whenever I did the analysis, I actually looked at all of these same receivers. I don't have enough data on that to say like how predictive it is yet, because I've only got it back to 2014, which means really the class of 2017 would have been the first one where I could really say, hey, I could have a full snapshot of their college career. I can now compare that to NFL production. So the sample size is small, but I wanted to mention it because Treylon Burks he flashed some real red flags there. Number one, 20% of his targets came at or behind the line of scrimmage, getting to line up in the backfield a lot, lining up in the slot a lot. He did play outside some, and he actually did well against press man coverage, against Texas A&M. He did it well against Alabama. But even then, it wasn't necessarily pretty. It's like the end product was still coming through with these big plays. But when I was watching the routes develop, I definitely had some concerns. I'm like, wow, he just nearly fell over there. And then the cornerback lost his footing. And then he still ended up catching, a long bomb. So there's a lot of context that goes into play with the data, which is honestly why I love visiting with you, like sitting down, talking through the film. So I do think that there are red flags in Treylon Burks's, profile. The thing I don't know, and this would actually be a question to you, they also had some really bad quarterback play. So you don't always know like all of the factors. Like part of it could have been, you know what, quarterbacks aren't really great. We're gonna put Treylon in this kind of role where it's just easier to get him the ball in space, right? And we don't have to worry about some of the mistakes from the quarterback. I think that could very well be a part of it. What I liked is even in that role, like he still showed an ability to be explosive. He's the third most explosive. Well, he ties for the second most explosive player in the class, graded again by the 15 plus reception. 15 plus yard receptions, based on the target. So 27%. Jamison Williams is number 1 in the class at 29%. You had 2 other guys at 27%, Garrett Wilson, as well as Kevin Austin Jr. So he was still able to come through and make plays. And a lot of that did come back to Rachaad. like he's pretty strong after the catch. I think the concerns I would have are similar to yours. I worry that if you just stick him on the outside and just tell him to start winning all the time,
good luck.
And to really do so, where he really came through, as far as the routes. So across these different routes that I was talking about, the staple routes for the NFL, if you look at Treylon Burks, he came in 14th out of 24 guys that I looked at in yards per route run across these staple routes. And so it's crossing routes, go routes, hitch routes, in routes, out routes, and slant routes. Those are the main ones. I excluded screens are technically part of it, but I excluded it because of all the different ways that the teams deploy the screenplay, and some are really high in it and some are really low. So it wasn't necessarily a consistent route. And I also think that's more scheme related, right? Versus like the receiver having to win and do something on their own. But he came through on the go route. Now it was limited sample, again, 22 targets on the go. On the in route, he came through, and then on the slant route, he also came through as well. So I feel like, to your point, like for me with Treylon Burks, I would love to see him land in a scheme where, one, you've got a creative coach that realizes, hey, to get him going, get early use out of him in the league, probably do need to really scheme up some things around the line of scrimmage. Let's not use the overplay, hey, next Deebo Samuel, any of that kind of stuff, but use him in a similar way, right? Create some of those looks for him. I think the other thing would be landing on a team where he can work inside more often, play from the slot. And then I think play action, getting him in zone coverages behind linebackers, in front of safeties, get him some cleaner reliefs, working him inside, use motion, things like that. And then let his raw skills that we do see show up on the film really come through right in the NFL offense. And so I do believe, to your point, landing spot probably, I'm not going to say probably, landing spot matters more for Treylon Burks than any other receiver that I have.
Amen. Yeah. And I think a lot of that is when you, and that has to do with, I mean, I think Matt Bowen said it best, is that he has the tools to become a good player against press coverage. But to me, that's saying that you have the tools, but you basically don't have the draft plans of knowing how to build the house. And when you watch him, to me, a big tell is that when you put a linebacker or defensive back in the break path and off coverage against Treylon Burks, he has no clue of how to finesse around that other than just try to run the guy over. And here's where the quarterback play gets in, to answer your question, is that I think it's a great point that the quarterback play probably wasn't great enough that they designed this to kind of get him the ball quickly as possible and easily as possible. So there's the corollary. That's the corollary to the point I'm about to make, which is that at the same time, and both of these can be true probably even, is that Treylon Burks oftentimes hurt his quarterback because of the fact that defenders could press him. He would get hung up trying to overpower them, and they would be on a schemed play where, say, it was a read to the back, drops back 3 steps, and the only option really to throw the ball was to Burks over the middle. And with the defender planted in the break path, Burks didn't get open, and then it forced the quarterback to have to scramble and try and create a play that really wasn't by design. And that happened a lot on Burks' film, in addition to maybe overrunning in zone routes and zone coverage, overrunning his open spot towards the adjacent defenders in the in the nearby zone, and eliminating his opportunity for a target because he didn't know when to stop. And so there were things like that on his tape that were concerns in terms of what he's going to have to address to become an outside receiver and a more, I would say, a more consistent inside receiver against zone. But yeah, the size, the ability to go up and win the ball, he's improved in that area. The footwork is there and the hands are there to become a better press release guy. Certainly the physicality is good enough. It's just a matter of him. He's going to have to work at it, know how to work smart and develop in those areas. And if an NFL team, relies on him early to do that, he's going to be like Kenny Golladay in New York. I mean, to me right now, you want him as Kenny Golladay in Detroit with, Marvin Jones and Golden Tate on either side, and him being able to run open underneath with, mismatches against defenders who are going to have to play a certain coverage or may not have the physical skills to match up with him. So Burks Burks obviously
And
stands out.
he is sliding right now. He's down 6 spots since really, draft season really got kicked off,
Yeah.
back in February, where we really started having, enough industry experts putting out their mock drafts and things like that. So he's slipping, and there's a chance that, early on we thought he'd probably be a top 15 pick. And at this point, like, there are rumors that he could slide out of the first. I think that could actually be problematic. Where I would like to see him land, I think optimal landing spots would be get him to Green Bay, where they use a lot of play action, they use a lot of motion, before the play. They're willing to run some stuff under center, do some different things. I think that, who knows if Aaron Rodgers can trust him? Like, that will be the thing. He'll have to earn that trust from Aaron Rodgers. But I wouldn't mind seeing him, there. I think Buffalo is another place where, he wouldn't right away. In Green Bay, he's going to have a lot of pressure on him right away with Devontae Adams being gone. And they have some complementary guys there, but there could be a lot of pressure on his plate. But I think in Buffalo, you've already got Stephon Diggs, who can beat any coverage, right? It doesn't matter, zone, man, press man. Stephon Diggs can do it all. Let him be more of a secondary guy, a little less attention on him. And Buffalo uses a ton of play action as well. And then I think the last place would be Tennessee. You've already got A.J. Brown there, but they've already shown the ability, right, to just use heavy play action with the in-breaking routes, get them into situations against zone coverage, against safeties and linebackers, dictating that with formations and things like that. Those would be 3 spots where, I think Green Bay's probably the most upside, probably also the scariest, because if they ask him to be Devontae Adams right out of the gate, like, that's not obviously, like, who can do that? But those will be nice landing spots. And the one nice thing is, if he does slide down the board, you have 2 picks, with Green Bay late in the first round. And then, last resort, I don't know how well the fit would work here, but you would definitely have a good quarterback. The Chiefs have 2 picks at the end of the first round. So you at least know you would be playing with Patrick Mahomes. But I worry a little more about what they may ask him to do in that scheme versus the other 3 teams.
Yeah, I honestly think Green Bay would be a disaster.
Do you?
Yeah, I really do. I think they need a guy who can play multiple roles, and I think Chris Olave would be like the ideal pick for them. Just a smooth, smart receiver who can win multiple
Olave's
ways
shooting up boards. I don't think he's going to make it to Green Bay.
I don't think he will either. But
Olave was the guy that originally, early on, I was really hoping would land at Green Bay or one of these other 2 teams. So.
Yeah, and a guy who I think could play the Olave part later that they could get is Khalil Shakir, and we can talk about him in a minute. But one guy that there's a trio of guys that look like fun to discuss that I don't get to talk about a lot, and they're a little. One's 2 are a little higher on this board than where I have them, and one is about maybe a little lower, but in the same, but in a logical spot. And those 3 guys are John Metchy, Wan'Dale Robinson, and David Bell. The most interesting one is Metchy because, when you look at Metchy, at least from the film perspective, Dwain, I like what he can do from the slot. There's some big playability with him after the catch. He tracks the ball very well, on vertical plays. Where I had issues with him is something that's correctable, but it's troublesome for players if they don't know how to address it. And that's just not knowing how to use his hands with targets basically arriving from his shoulders to his waist. Like, he screws those up so often that I see drops that he just needs to avoid making, that he should be able to avoid. And I had, and he dropped down my board for that was a big reason why he dropped on my board. I mean, I think he's another guy who can become a contributor, if not a starter. And there's some cool things to like about his game, but the consistency at the catch point was troublesome to me.
Yeah. And so in the model, just because there's so much noise, and I'm not, I totally get where you're coming from. Like, I exclude drops in the model because they're just not sticky year over year. So you could have really high drops one year and the next year they're low, and then they could be high again, and then you could have 0. Like, we've really seen it, jump all over the place. So it's tough for me to include it because it does that so much.
And before you go on, the good point about that too is that it can be, to me, I think what would be great is somehow we can figure out one day a context that shows that it's tied to technique as opposed to tied towards, the caliber of the throws, what the different noise factors are. Because if it's technique, it might be stickier if we could figure that out. that would be my theory that I would posit that we don't have any proof for. But, from just observation, whereas maybe if you have a bad quarterback, say Justyn Ross with the guy he had last year, if you have more difficult targets to deal with, it might be more logical that you're going to have more drops with more difficult targets that you have to try to catch. If you're getting led into contact more, or more away from your frame, or not placed where the route is breaking, things like that. But it's hard to suss that all out, I imagine, right?
No, yeah. I mean, there are some things that you just mentioned that I've definitely, I have access to data and I've tried looking at some of it. I haven't gotten as far as I want to with it, but like really the quarterback accuracy charting stuff that PFF does, where you can have passes that are accurate within the frame, right? You should just pretty much always catch those. You might have a concentration lap, every once in a while. But then you have really, they're inaccurate but catchable, meaning the quarterback may not have done the absolute best job, but right, it's still the receiver's job at that point to go ahead and catch the ball. Those can lead to contested situations, things like that. And then there's really just the passes that may be uncatchable. And the receiver may even get a hand on it, a fingertip on it, that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, like we just wouldn't expect a receiver to catch that ball like at a high rate. So I think there's some opportunities to bake that in there. But where I kind of struggle still, even with this cool data that we have at PFF, is just like when the quarterback releases the ball, the receiver can be wide open, like on their break, and the quarterback is a tick late. And then all of a sudden, it may be accurate and in the frame, but it's a contested catch every time because the throw's late. So technically the throw is accurate, but it's like it really didn't work the way the play was supposed to.
Baker Mayfield.
Yes, and I do think that's where larger sized receivers still can have an advantage, right? Versus some of these other guys that are really trying to win with technique, with separation, and they're trying to do it, in timing of the play. And if they can get the ball, they have a quarterback that can deliver that. And do it. Like last year, great example. We know how good of a route runner Devonta Smith is, how well he can separate. But Jalen Hurts is not a timing quarterback.
Right.
Like, there's stuff coming, and and Jalen Hurts actually improved his accuracy by like 7% last year. But when the ball is getting to Devonta Smith, it ends up being contested when it really shouldn't have ever been contested. And contested catches are not Devonta Smith's strong suit.
No.
He's a slider receiver, and when he's having to take contact, it's problematic. So, I mean, some of that it's not necessarily in Devonta Smith's skill set, but when you look at how Smith wins, like Jalen Hurts wasn't doing him any favors. So, to your point, there's just a lot of nuance with it. I think there are some layers of it we could dig into. It's actually something like we could talk about more too, like with some of the technique stuff, but those are some of the things where it's like there's so many layers to it. Like honestly, I've kind of set it on the side burner.
Yeah.
It's just like, okay, I'm going to come back to this at some point, but like there's all these other things that I'm trying to dig into right now. But I think the points you make like are really great. And with Metchy, I had him in tier 3 in my original screenshot I sent to you. He moved into tier 2 again because draft capital is the number one driver in this model right now.
Right.
So this could change a lot come next week. Because, and you say it so greatly, like in the RSP, like I can't remember your exact phrase, but it's basically, look, the higher your draft capital, the more chances you get to screw up.
Yeah.
And your team doesn't pull you off of the field. So Metchy right now has moved up to expected draft position of 62. So that is actually like, I think that's one of the bigger movers. He's up 20 spots like since February. So the biggest mover is like Calvin Austin at 53 picks. You got Sky Moore up to he's up 54 picks. So Metchy's right behind those. He's the third. He's moved the third most since then.
GM's logo scout. I'm just going to tell you they do. As much as we talk about logo scouting isn't a good thing, this is a great example of that because as much as I like some things about John Metchy, his game didn't really show up as well as this draft capital is indicating right now.
Well, even if you just look at the grid that I've got up, like he doesn't really match up. Like if you look at Sky Moore and like because blue is good, red is bad on this. Sky Moore pretty much blue across. Now Pickens had a couple of little red things there, but it's more I'm giving him an injury discount, and he also what he did at such a young age. We saw the flash really early on, but like with Metchy, if you look at it, I mean his career dominator. So for folks that don't know what career dominator is, that's taking really all of your yardage and your touchdowns over your career as a share of what the team did. So if the team threw for 10,000 yards, and I had 10,000 yards in that time, I'd have a 10%, yardage dominator, but it combines the two things with touchdowns as well. And so like 12%, 20%, I don't mind it as much at big programs because typically they're loaded, right? And so they're going to spread the ball a little bit more, but that's still pretty low for Metchy. His career yards per route run, 2.22. That's one of the lowest in the class. It's definitely one of the lowest guys in the top 10 guys that I have listed here. And then yards per route run is also lower. It's a 2.41. So draft capital is really starting to push him up the board more than necessarily even what some of the data that I have is really showing. In my model, the best score you can get is a 4. He's a 2.68. So to give you an idea, that's not like saying he's awesome. It's saying he's above average in the model.
So give me some thoughts about Robinson and David Bell. Anything that you observed that you thought was fascinating about those guys, good or bad?
Man, I like David Bell. And honestly, the draft capital is killing him. The draft capital is killing him right now in the model. He's now projected to, look, you'll notice he's the only guy I still have in tier 2 that's being picked outside of the top 75 picks. And what he did so early in his career from a production standpoint is really what's keeping him there. He's so good that he's still at a 2.60 in my model. And if you drop down to the next tier, you're getting into 2.5s and 2.3s. So that actually, honestly, that's a positive thing in my eyes. I mean, I have to put Bell where he goes on the page, but it's a positive thing that he was so good so early in his career, and he demanded such a large share of his team's offense. From a dominator standpoint, his best year was 44% of the team's offense and touchdowns. Career is what's really nice. The 28%, he hit a 30% breakout. He hit a 30% dominator at the age of 19.7 years old. 18.7 years old, he had already hit the 20%. So he did everything right out of the gate, with Purdue. So there's a ton of great things going on with David Bell. The only thing dragging him down is the expected draft position. And you know why that's happening is just because the NFL cares too much about 40 times.
Yeah.
They're so concerned about the stupid 40 time that's driving David Bell down the board. Yeah. And so there's a chance right now that we don't see him. I really hope he gets picked at least by the 3rd round. Because if he goes in the 4th round and 5th round, you know what happens to a lot of those guys. They just get lost in the shuffle, especially if the coaching staff changes the next year and then the GM doesn't care anymore. It's just a lot of stuff becomes out of the player's control at that point, as much as we don't want to ever admit it. But man, if he ended up for some reason, all it takes is one team. If all of a sudden,
they trade up in the early 1st round or 2nd round,
if he became a mid-2nd round pick, I can do it right now. I'm looking at it. If I change his pick to being 40 overall, he immediately jumps up all the way. He jumps all the way to 2.
Then you're looking at
this tier.
Yeah, and just call him Big Jarvis because he's Jarvis Landry in that respect in terms of what he can offer a team. And I think
those were his concerns.
Yeah.
Not a very explosive career target. Only a 19%, one of the worst ones in the class. So those are the receptions of 15 plus yards or more.
Yeah.
His best yards per route run was only a 2.7. Career was a 2.36. So he's not hyper explosive after the catch, but he's definitely a player that I think you can trust inside or in a Z role, letting him, work more underneath. And he's really good in contested catch situations. So even though he may not be as explosive, he's really good at the thing that he does, and it shows up really in all the production metrics.
So to me, let's compare and contrast Calvin Austin and Wan'Dale Robinson because for me, I have Austin, Robinson, and Khalil Pimpleton 1, 2, and 3 in a little block because they almost look alike as guys who might not be able to ride the ride in terms of the size factor and how the NFL has looked at them. But it's interesting to me to look at this and see that Robinson has a lot of the dominators in blue, whereas Austin doesn't. But where we're looking at career yards per route run. And then more explosive target. Yeah. And that's kind of where, and Austin to me has more of an outside game that might have a shot of being unlocked. Whereas I look at Wan'Dale Robinson and I think he has some real technical flaws that are hard to correct with tracking the football to be able to win some of the plays that I think Austin might be able to show. If I were a GM, I would say, go ahead, let some teams take Wan'Dale Robinson earlier. I'm going to take Austin and get him in camp And I know I've got him as a return specialist, a gadget guy on some over stuff, and then also as a guy who maybe in the slot, and then maybe like during camp and during preseason, I'm going to match him up outside and get him drawn against top corners and see if he can win like he did at Memphis last year. And if we have something there, I think I got maybe a small steal. But you tell me, what have you seen with the difference between these two guys?
So I actually agree with a lot of what you just said. When I look at Austin, I see a player that's more diverse than Wan'Dale Robinson. Robinson, a lot of this stuff, he worked down the field some, but a lot of this stuff, again, is around the line of scrimmage. And so you have to be careful when you get into these really high target rates and things like that, and how they're tied to players. Like we talked about it with Burks, 20% of those receptions coming at or behind the line of scrimmage. Once you move to the NFL, the biggest change is you're not getting as many of those.
No.
You're gonna have to catch a lot more of those between 1 and 10 yards down the field. It's a 10% flip, like in the way the targets work in the NFL versus the way they work in college, from behind the line of scrimmage versus in that first 10 yards down the field. And so that's where I do worry about Robinson. Like at the end of the day, like what I would really like to do with this model at some point is just have better inputs from like people like you around the film. Like how do we combine what we're getting with the data, what we're getting with the film? Because I watch it and I see it, but I'm not as good as you. I don't have the process that you have. And honestly, it's like I trust the numbers more than myself as a film grader. Right. So it's like I need to partner with someone where I can do something like this and we could do some cool stuff. And maybe that's something we could talk about later. But when I look at Wan'Dale Robinson, it's really, just the fact that he's younger than Calvin Austin, the model. He's 21.7 years old. He'll be 21.7 as a rookie. Calvin Austin will be 23.5. So that immediately dings Austin, moves him down the board. And again, this is just based on looking at players that have come out and performed well early in their NFL careers.
Right.
These are guidelines. This does not mean like, it drives me insane when people do stuff like what I'm doing here. I think this is cool and I love doing it, but anytime someone comes to me that they've got an absolute take on something, I pretty much I hate to say this, I pretty much just dismiss them. Because there are not absolutes in this stuff.
It's a filter. It's a filter at the end, not the filter at the beginning.
And you're playing probabilities.
Yes.
What people don't want to admit is that there's another side of the probability, right? Which is, okay, great. The model historically says Wan'Dale Robinson has a 10% better hit rate than a guy like Calvin Austin. But you also have to realize that there's also a chance that Calvin Austin could outperform Wan'Dale Robinson. And if he did, like, what would that look like? You know, and that's why I like, these kind of conversations around where the fit and things may happen. But I do agree that Austin, because he has that downfield presence already, 26% explosive, career explosive target rate versus Wan'Dale Robinson, that was only 19%. And so I think, there's just a big difference in the way that you can use the two players. So if you could, and here's what I'll say, it's harder to be able to do the thing that Calvin Austin can already do than the thing that Wan'Dale Robinson can already do. Yeah. Wan'Dale Robinson hasn't shown to be able to really be a vertical threat in the league. And honestly, most guys that haven't shown that, they don't become that.
No.
But you do see guys pick up in their game and all of a sudden the team uses them a different way. And you're like, wow, he was a deep threat in college, but now he's working underneath. Now he can work, in the shorter game. And I do think there are potentially elements, to Calvin Austin's game. Again, the age thing was huge for Austin. Being 23 and a half years, it counts a lot, in this model. So expected draft position is first, then production is second, but age is third in this model. Just historically, we've seen the players that are coming out and they're younger. And I do try to go look too, like, did they miss a season? Are there things like that may have pushed their age up? And sometimes those are the cases. But those are the three biggest drivers in the model.
Well, the two players who were just screaming at me in this model, I mean, just
like pissing you off, screaming, or you're like, no,
like they're shouting like in a big neon sign, value, like potential value, are Justyn Ross and Khalil Shakir. Like when I see like Justyn Ross, first of all, he has the best yards per route run of your best year. Best year, he was number one.
Best year, yeah.
And so you could say, well, Trevor Lawrence, that's that was the factor, but also that tells you how bad the quarterback play he had at Clemson, both on tape, and probably metrics last year, and playing with a foot injury. And even still, and even with like Clemson having some pretty good receivers during Justyn Ross's career, has some pretty good numbers up here. And where the numbers aren't so great, they're not that far away from being in the blue, actually, from what I can tell when I look at some of these guys who are in the blue.
The thing that's most concerning with him is his best dominator year being 24%. I can actually understand his career being a little bit lower because he didn't get, he didn't play, as much, because he had to battle through some of the injuries. So I kind of discount that a little bit when I look at Ross. But yeah, the things that flash about Ross, he's coming out a little bit later because of the injuries. Like he could have come out, but I think he probably would have been someone that came out at age 21, had he not been battling the injuries. But he's 22.7, so that's dinging him a little bit in the model. I think you could make an easy argument that because of the injuries and things he battled, like if I put 21.7 in there, right, which is only the difference of 1 year, it's going to move him up. But the things that you mentioned, the things that are really huge at 18.7 years old, he had his 20%, he accounted for 20% of a Clemson offense that had a lot of really good players on it. Yeah. And so it's not the same as saying, hey, you came into some offense that didn't have anyone and you earned 20%. Like, honestly, if you're playing with other players that are being drafted, and this is something really cool Kevin Cole does in his model that I need to add to this, but if you are playing with anyone that gets drafted in those first like 100 picks, I can't remember where Kevin has his cutoff, but if you're playing with other players that get drafted in the first 100 picks that you played with at your school, so that's also looking back to guys that have already come out, it's basically you just double some of these numbers. You 2x the career dominator, you 2x the best dominator. Because look, if you're sharing, Ohio State does this all the time. That's why you see Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, like in different programs, probably are 40% guys because they've got a split and they have other guys there, right? And they play with other guys that are already in the NFL that were really good as well. So, I mean, I think you have to account for that. You see this a lot with Alabama as well. But the thing with Justyn Ross is that career yards per route of 2.99 is the best of all the guys in the class. And his best yards per route season blows everyone away. It's what screws the whole scale up. You got guys at the top that are only light blue because Justyn Ross is at a 4.98. Like, and it's so far ahead of everyone else. Like the next closest one is Christian Watson at a 4.33. I really like Watson. The thing that's driven him down the board is his draft stock has fallen 32 picks since February. So that's the second most of these higher guys, behind only David Bell, who's dropped 41 spots.
Yeah. Give me Christian Watson and Justyn Ross all day. Like, I mean, Ross to me, Watson played in a West Coast offense. And a true West Coast offense, which means that he's going to have a better foundation for understanding working with zone coverages and being on the same page with your quarterback and the verbiage of offenses and concepts that you're going to see more commonly in the NFL, even with the NFL going to more spread types of looks. Watson and then has more weight that he can add to his frame. He's already a big dude who can run. He can add another 20 pounds. I'm not 20 pounds, another 8 to 12 pounds and get to around 220. And that dude has a chance to be a monster of an athlete. And then with Ross, I mean, to me, Ross is the best guy. You can mug Justyn Ross, and he doesn't even notice what you're doing to him. He just doesn't even pay attention to you. He just flicks you off like that and makes the play. And the fact that he played, to me, that now that as long as the doctor is being genuine, and I have no reason to think he isn't, when the doctor who operated on Ross with this neck injury that no football players ever tried to come back to play with. If the doctor said, which he did on ESPN's article, that Ross has no greater chance of a catastrophic injury playing football than any other football player who steps on the field right now, if that's really true, and I have no reason to think it isn't, then I look at the foot injury that he had this past year since the Georgia game and played all year on his Jones fracture. And, a mutual friend of ours, Dwain, I asked him about this, who had a biomechanics background, and said, all right, 4.5, 640, 31 vertical, those all meet the thresholds of like that you can play in the NFL. May not be what NFL people like when they look at combine numbers.
And honestly, the NFL overrates everything combine to do with receivers.
They
do it at most positions, but receivers, honestly, like if you really, and a good way to weed it out is like compare it to draft capital.
Yeah.
And so like Kevin Cole actually did a great series on this, probably like 6 weeks ago by each position. Basically the things that the NFL probably overvalues about athleticism, and even some of the ones they're probably undervaluing that actually do show to have some correlation to future success, even after accounting for draft pick, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of it just really becomes noise.
Yeah.
You
And
got to, yeah.
that's the thing that I've kind of noted is I always try and tell people that when I grade players and I incorporate combine data, I have a much lower barrier to entry with those metrics in certain
Well, you
with certain
mentioned it,
metrics.
it's thresholds. You don't want to like you don't want a guy that runs a 5 flat, obviously,
Right.
right? You know,
But
we
a
know
four
that.
but it doesn't matter if he runs a 4.2 if 4.4 is fast enough or 4.5 is
Yes.
fast enough or even 4.6 is fast enough if he has the skills to play the game, you
Yeah.
know. And but like
But the
Ross,
killer is because the NFL overvalues it, it
yeah.
pushes these guys down the board. Then they don't get the draft capital. Then they don't get the benefit of the doubt. And it just
Yes.
becomes this vicious cycle.
It does. And Ross, to me, though, the fact that he ran a 4.56 and did all this, I mean, I remember mentioning, I said, well, he had 6 to 8 weeks to train, and most guys were healthy and not immobilized for 8 weeks after surgery and had a good 12 to 13 weeks to train to game the system that's the combine. And, and I asked this guy, our mutual friend, about it, and he said, he goes, there's no way Justyn Ross was even healthy competing at the combine. He said he'll when he gets into camp, we'll probably, once he's like in training camp, we'll probably see a healthier Justyn Ross. And at that point, I think you're going to hear some team beat writer quote a coach going, he's way more explosive than we thought.
Just put him with Trevor Lawrence and we won't have to worry about it.
I would love that. Yes, exactly. So
You know?
let's end with Khalil Shakir,
Yeah.
and then maybe someone you want to point out as well. But like Shakir also kind of sticks out. He's 19.6 at his dominator rating there, and then he had a 2.8 in shabby for his career yards per route run, and he's neutral. I guess he's got a neutral color with the best year, but big playability, not bad.
Yeah,
And
25% is still good.
yeah,
It's not up there with Jameson and some of these other guys, but yeah, it's still very strong.
yeah. And to me, this is one of the more versatile receivers. He's a guy where the hands issues are a good example of a Deontay Johnson, where like it's more of lapses that he can fix. And I would look, if I'm going to look at it from just a narrative perspective or a qualitative perspective, it is Deontay Johnson was the type of player who had hands issues coming out of school. He had early on success, but he was probably dealing with easier opportunities. The next year, he led the league in drops. And then the year after that, he realized that he needed to readdress his fundamentals and started doing the old tennis ball, catch with the fingertips thing, making sure he was drilling the hell out of that. And he didn't have a drop until like week 12, week 13, I think,
Yeah,
last
he got
year.
the yips a little bit after that, but yeah, no. And again, that's the thing. I mean, with the the drops thing, I think there's a lot of nuance to it, and I honestly don't. And look, when you get guys like this, like Shakir, that's got a best dominator seating, it accounted for 46% of this team's offense.
Yeah.
I mean, through the air, it's like okay, like if he really sucked and he couldn't catch a ball, he would never do that. Like
Right.
they wouldn't throw him the ball that much. So I think with Shakir, like, yeah, there's some positives. Like I notice, you're kind of like me. It's like you go to like, look, some of these guys, and that's what happens when you get down to tier 2 and tier 3. If you look at, the tier 1 guys, you got really strong capital and overall, pretty good marks across the board. But then as you get into tier 2 and tier 3, it's really more about highlighting guys that have certain specific strengths that like really make them, that make them pop out. And I think you hit on the ones, with Shakir. And he also, he hit the 20%, threshold as far as dominator rating at 19.6 years old. So that's really young. And he did get to the 30% mark as well at 20.6. So a lot of guys on here never got to both of those marks. So I think that's good for Khalil Shakir.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else you want to mention here that just something stuck out to you that I didn't?
The guy that everybody seems to love and they're pushing them up the board, and I just don't get it. And even despite me giving him increased draft capital, like the model still doesn't like him, is Alec Pierce.
Okay.
Doesn't have a good career dominator, never had a best dominator. never even got to a 30%er. Yards per route run, 2.18. Best yards per route season, 2.46. And I know people listening, they're like, what does that even mean? That's really low. That's the third worst in the class. His career 2.18 is fourth worst in the class. You get rid of Kyle Phillips and some of these other crappy guys and just look at like the top, crappy guys, I shouldn't say it that way, but top 20, if you look at like the top 22 prospects, like he's in the bottom 3 of those things. So I don't know, like his explosive, you notice this tier 4 is really, you got a lot of guys that have shown the ability to be explosive, but a lot of the other things are not popping for them.
Yeah.
And so he fits into that tier, but like, I just feel like the NFL's kind of oversold themselves on Alec Pierce. Not that he can't be good, but like he's climbed 25 spots in draft capital. He's now projected to go, in the early third round, second. He's now projected to go just at the end of the second round. Like I don't get it. And then when I watch the film of him, it's like, I like him, but I don't get overly excited about anything that I saw, from Alec Pierce.
Yeah. And I can understand that. So,
but maybe you did.
I liked him. I liked him. And I think that he would be a good fit in an Arthur Smith offense where he could be, or any offense where they can bunch him early on. They can use him tight to the line. He can be a good blocker, and then he can drift out into routes on play action against linebackers and safeties and nickel corners, and he's very good at winning at the catch point. That's where he really succeeds, is that his technique to track the ball and win in tight coverage in the vertical game stands out to me. The route running isn't Justin Jefferson like, but the athletic ability is close. And I think the routes will get there for him to be good. I don't think he'll be great like Jefferson, but I think he's a solid prospect who I think has potential to become a starter. And I have him in the range of a guy like Christian Watson. But I think the compelling thing that's fascinating is it could be a different combination in this, but I'm either wrong about Desmond Ridder, who I just don't think is anywhere worth what he's being rated, and that Pierce is covered up a little bit by the work that Ridder did that I don't know to the life of me why people love him, or it's that Ridder made Pierce look better than he is, and I didn't see that. I thought Pierce made Ridder look better. But Ridder was kind of at the expense of Pierce in terms of his play. But let's talk running backs and take a look at some of these guys, because and with some time left, we probably have about 20 minutes left with this. But for starters, I mean, it's fascinating to me because there's a lot of blue on this chart. Which kind of also indicates to me that the data supports that this class has some depth to it. There's some talents in this class, and there's just not a lot of opportunities. Right off the bat, like if 1, 2, and 3, that's pretty locked. Everyone seems to be pretty lockstep that Hall, Walker, and Spiller are guys worth paying attention to. Where it gets fascinating to me is the Rachaad White. For me, like, Rachaad White is a guy who, like Treylon Burks for me, he can contribute, give him in the right circumstance, and maybe he can develop into being that every down back or a lead back. But I feel like that from what I saw, where work comes between the tackles, the decision making is where I have real concerns with him, and that's where backs. I'm coining it this. There, good backs run to open leverage. Backs who struggle in the NFL run to open space. And Rachaad White, Kyron Williams, those are examples of guys who get to run to open space in college, but they're running open space rather than running open leverage. And when the leverage closes off and they notice it, they try and change their tune, and they end up on the ground, or losing yards trying to avoid a situation where they needed to just take the hard yards.
Basically, they're the opposite of Brian Robinson. Like, he does a nice job, of understanding that. Like, the quickest way that I can understand leverage is I just go watch inside zone plays for everyone, and I just watch them back to back to back to back, because it's really not designed to just like, because wide zone, right? Immediately you could just be faster than everybody. It's like, okay, I'm out of the outside, right? I'm gone. I like watching the players, and there's different types of inside zone. You've got the split inside zone, and you've got, your duo, double duo, all that kind of stuff. But just watching them work the leverage and manipulate the next level, right? Of, okay, I'm going to set up like this to get the linebacker to go one way, but then I'm going to cut back off of this block, right, and create this space for myself. And I saw flashes of it for Rachaad White, but to your point, it wasn't consistent. The big thing, and just to real quick for folks that are listening or looking, so we talked about receivers a second ago. So the components like of the model for the running backs, age obviously is a part of it. Again, now weight is a much bigger deal for running backs than it is for receivers. Expected draft capital is still the number one driver because, as Matt mentions, it correlates to opportunity. And then you got your career yards per game. So that includes passing, work in the passing game plus the rushing game. You got a best yards percentage season. Then you got a best touchdown percentage. So I split them out a little bit different than the dominator for the receivers. And then you got similar, more of the efficiency stuff. You've got your career explosive rush rate. So instead of 15 yards, these are carries of 10 plus yards or more. And then you have your avoided tackles per attempt. So really just the elusiveness, and the 40-yard dash does matter. I don't have it on the screen, but actually the 10-yard split, is also included here. And so, it's Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, like you mentioned, Isaiah Spiller at the top. But tier one is Breece Hall and Kenneth Walker by themselves. If you are in a fantasy draft, like there's no doubt you're taking Breece Hall because he's already proven the receiving chops and everything else as well. I think Kenneth Walker is the better just pure running back.
I agree.
I just watched Kenneth Walker run. He's a better runner than Breece Hall, but I don't know if he's going to turn into someone in the receiving game or not. Actually, I would love to get your thoughts on that, because when I watch how fluid of an athlete is, I have trouble thinking that he can't catch a ball. He's got.
This is where it's hard. This is where it's kind of absent for a lot of folks, because I had high marks for receiving for Kennedy Brooks, Jonathan Taylor, and Leonard Fournette in the past, but it was based on low quantity of targets. It was on quality of targets. And what Walker does, he shows the hand-eye coordination to catch football. The routes he runs well. The difference between Hall and Walker is that Walker basically is a more refined back. Hall is a slightly more explosive back. And I would say, and I know that 40-yard dash is big with this model. I tend to look more at the 20 and 3 cone with those guys. But Hall is, to me, Hall has a little bit more of a ceiling and a little bit more of a floor, whereas Walker is a little steadier all around with his game athletically, technically, and conceptually.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I feel like Walker actually, if he does get the receiving side, or we happen to find that he can do that and they just didn't use him in that way, I think Kenneth Walker is the more explosive back and the more elusive back. I like Breece Hall, but when I watch, there's just so many things honestly, there's things Kenneth Walker can do that no one else in the class can do. His ability to just kind of set up move after move. There's just not anybody else in the class that can make one guy miss, immediately make the next guy miss, and then beat an angle to take it all away. Breece Hall is much more of, he doesn't have those same type. He doesn't move in the same way. He still breaks long runs, right? But when I watch Breece Hall's film, it's much more the blocking worked perfectly and he hit it. And I think it shows up in their career explosive run rate, 14% for Breece Hall versus 17% for Walker. Career avoided tackles per attempt, 33% for Kenneth Walker. That ranks in the 98th percentile back to 2014 for this stuff. So it's way up there.
I'll say I have some tape to suggest to watch for Hall that kind of shows some of that make you miss ability that's very creative in space. But I agree that overall Walker shows that more often on tape. I would agree with that assessment for sure.
I think it was Thor Nystrom yesterday posted a video of Kenneth Walker, and he put it to Benny Hill music.
Yeah,
it's hilarious. It's nobody can get their hands on him. Now sometimes he gets himself into trouble with that. He cuts back. On a lot of plays, I saw him make cutbacks that he didn't necessarily need to do, and that could turn some NFL coaches off early in his career. So he's going to need to be careful probably with that.
Yeah.
But those guys at the top, it kind of go to that tier. Sorry, I got us on a little bit of a rabbit trail there, but Rachaad White, the big thing that's pushing him up in the model, he was a JUCO transfer. He's an older guy. If he wasn't 23.7 years old, honestly, he would be in tier 2 with Isaiah Spiller in the way that the model works.
Right.
But he's a late bloomer, but that 134 career yards per game, like, is pushing him up there. Now you have to be careful because Breece Hall is at 129, and Breece Hall played every year.
Yeah.
So they're not the same. You know what I mean?
Yes.
The 129 that Breece Hall has is not the same as Rachaad White, because Rachaad White wasn't playing when he was a freshman. Breece Hall was already doing that as a freshman. And that's an area where Isaiah Spiller, also, not as impressive as the first two guys, but 103 yards per game. And he was doing that starting off very early in his career. He was involved in the A&M backfield. So, but he's definitely slipped in his draft capital expectations. But so the way I name these tiers to help people like listening or watching, so that first tier is high draft capital. And when I say high draft capital, that means they're probably going to be drafted in the early to mid second round by then. And right now, that's what they're expected. Breece Hall's expected to go off the board by pick 36, Kenneth Walker by pick 45. So they're by far the top two. Isaiah Spiller's at pick 72. So he's in tier 2. That's good draft capital, a good production profile. But that top tier is, even better draft capital and what I would consider to be more along of not an elite production profile. So not like a Jonathan Taylor or a Christian McCaffrey, but the level below that, a great production profile for Breece Hall and for Kenneth Walker. But then this next tier, Rachaad White, James Cook, Zamir White, Brian Robinson Jr., Dameon Pierce, they're all expected to get the draft capital. But we have limited sample sizes on all of them. So Rachaad White pops up blue in a lot of these things, but really it's based on 1 year.
Yeah.
So he's kind of similar to these other guys that I've got a lot, they actually were playing for 3 years at their schools, sharing time. For example, James Cook, Zamir White, when you're in Georgia, like, they just recruit well, you're going to share time. So it's hard. The career yards per game, the best, their best season percentage of team yards, those things, they show up as red, right?
Yeah.
In this chart. But NFL teams, and some of it is probably what you mentioned, it's logo buying, right? They're logo shopping. This is a logo shopping tier for sure with Cook, Zamir White, Brian Robinson, Dameon Pierce, but they're all expected to have draft capital, and they do show flashes of different things, that you see in their game. And I think this is honestly the tier where, for me, it was the most important. Like, I really watched all of these guys thoroughly on film, because I don't think the data tells the complete story by any means, because they had to share so much time with other really talented players in their programs.
And I would note that there are other players that really stand out to me based on this career yards per game, that are either overrated or underrated based on this a little bit, at least from my own perspective from the film, which is Tyler Algier. I think he's just a bit of an overrated player, but he's been so productive, and he pretty much had a stranglehold on that offense, in terms of getting the ball at that position, that I think it drives him up a little bit more, even if I have some issues with him. Jerome Ford.
That is, to your point, why he's in the tier below. So that's solid producers who should be drafted. So, basically, they had production. They're going to get drafted, but some of the underlying traits don't just really, necessarily pop off the screen for you. And Algier and the NFL is basically echoing what you're saying, because look at the expected draft capital on all these guys.
Well, I'm going to go. I'm actually going to go a bit further on this and say Tyler Algier is the scout's desire to say he's very productive. I don't really like him, but he's really productive. And if I don't give him a 4th round grade, then it might look bad, because I'm going to have to make a real stance. This is that guy the manager who gives his employee a 3 on an evaluation because he's afraid to give the guy a 2 or a 1 and get him fired. I think Tyler Algier is a special teamer, but that's my own take. But in contrast, a guy like Jerome Ford, who played in Alabama and then at first, now at Cincinnati. And then you look at guys like Kevin Harris, who split time, Kennedy Brooks, who had Ramondre Stevenson, and Trey Sermon, and a few other guys, Eric Gray, that he's always contending with. And the fact that he's still barely in the blue and then you look at the explosive rush and some of the other things with him, he's a compelling guy. I would, so those are guys that are Keontae Ingram, who had Bijan Robinson to contend with 2 years ago, is an example of a guy who's kind of in that area. So it's fascinating to see the differences with that particular metric with some of these players. Who else? I mean, who stood out to you that in any way that you want to talk about with this class.
Yeah, and just really quick for the folks listening, so that tier 4, solid producers who should be drafted. When I say should be drafted, like we're talking pick 169, 167, 175, 174. So typically, if you're mocking in that range, you're going to get drafted, right? There's probably not a chance that you're going to go undrafted. Then you got the next tier and Kennedy Brooks is really climbing up. I actually need to move him into tier 4 because he has jumped. He actually jumped from not even having expected draft capital a week ago to now he's at 163. So he really belongs in the tier above. But what I loved about him, and you already hit on it, the career explosive rush rate of 21% was the highest in the class. Career avoided tackles per attempt, 31%, which was third behind Kenneth Walker and then behind Jerrion Ealy, who's really a totally different kind of back, right? Ealy's really more of the small scat back, not facing a lot of heavy boxes, not getting carries on early down work. So I don't really consider those things to be, they're not the same. That's not even apples to apples. Kennedy Brooks, you're really comparing to a guy more like Kenneth Walker. So I've spent a lot of time watching Kennedy Brooks, and I'll be honest, I don't know if it's the 40 time. I don't know what it is. The small hands, like his hands are under 8 inches, which is like super, super, super small. Teams get weirded out by weird stuff, but it's really nice to see that his draft capital is actually climbing. His 10-yard split was a 1.54 at 209 pounds. Like, that's really good. Breece Hall was 1.54 at 217 pounds. Like, to give you an idea, Kenneth Walker's the best 10-yard split in the class at a 1.49. And I like 10-yard split. And even Kevin Cole's proven this is more valuable in the 40 because, look, most of the damage you're going to do as a running back is what are you going to do in that first 10 yards, right? Once you get to the next level, there's angles and things. Yeah, it'd be nice to have the long speed, but how many plays a year really come down to that long speed? It's really about what you can do in that first 10, 15, 20 yards. So Kennedy Brooks, for me, really checks a lot of the different boxes. And to your point, if you consider who he's played with that have been drafted into the league, to see that he still ended up with 93 yards per game over his career. That's really strong. 34% of the team's offense in his best season. And then, great. Touchdown rate wasn't as high, 30%, but touchdowns can be a bit fluky. So that's the smallest thing actually in the model. It's not accounting for a ton of value in the way that the metrics are being are counting or adding up, right, to basically give you a score in the way that they're weighted. But yeah, Kennedy Brooks is the one. Like, that's the big one that pops out to me that I'm like, wow, if we get a surprise and all of a sudden he goes in the 3rd round even, like, he's going to move way up. He's going to move way up this list because he's blue almost all the way across the board, as you can see. And he's older, but he also, again, we will see this sometimes, guys that are coming out that are older that played with a lot of really other good competition, but what they're told by their agent is, look, you don't have enough good film. You're not going to be a high enough pick. And so there are different things that factor into why these guys stay in college longer. So he is definitely the one for me. The one other that I would ask you, I know we're probably up against time here, but just, your thoughts really on Dameon Pierce. So Dameon Pierce is a guy that didn't get a lot of reps in college for whatever reason. And it's funny, when I watched him last night and I watched everything. I watched his inside zone, his outside zone, watched him run power. He was really good as a pass blocker. That stuck out to me immediately just watching him play. But he's just very inconsistent. One play I'd be like, wow, that looked really good. And then the next play I was like, what the hell are you doing? What's going on? But that 10-yard split of 1.51. So look, his 40 doesn't look good. It's a 4.59. It looks like it's bad. But that first 10 yards, he's a 1.51 at 218 pounds, only going to be 22 and a half years old in his rookie season. So he was the one I was most excited to ask you about, and what your thoughts are on Pierce, given the limited sample. We don't have a ton of film to go off of, but I know you've watched probably all of it.
Yeah. I mean, well, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, this is why also I like looking at Excel, at 20 shuttle and 3-cone drills, because they also give you, that acceleration through the hole when you head through a straight line. I want to see you not only get through the hole in the first 10 yards, I want to see you threaten safeties. And
so you had a really fun this year, Matt, trying to track down 20 and 3-cone. I left it out, honestly, because we didn't have it for so many guys.
Exactly. So, but what's nice is it's okay because I look at the tape, and the tape tells me a lot too. It can be sometimes you can have some false positives or false negatives with that. But I can tell you, I wrote somebody about 2 months before the combine. I said, I'm just saving this as a receipt that Kyron Williams is not going to perform well at the combine. Like that's not, and they were giving away 4.38s. It felt like, we know that's not true, but it was like, it seemed like everybody was getting a 4.3 or a low 4.4. So, looking at Pierce, what stuck out to me was his ability to plant and transition from an east-west direction to a north-south direction within a step. When you can do that, when you can make that fluid transition downhill from a lateral approach path and make that one cut downhill like that at the edge of the tackle box or outside the tackle box, that tells me you have explosion and good footwork, and Dameon Pierce has that. He certainly can be a good tackle breaker. I think that in the right system, he could be a lead back. He gives me a lot of Marion Barber vibes in terms of some of the things that he can do, because he's a very good pass catcher.
He's a violent runner.
He is a violent runner, that's for sure. He needs to make sure that he doesn't keep running when his helmet's off. But hey, that's another story for FSU one day. But he certainly. Do I think he's the next Marshawn Lynch? No, I'm not with Doug Farrar on that one. But listen, that's okay. I think he is an underrated back who can be a committee contributor. I think where he's rated here makes sense. I think that's probably, I may have him a little lower in terms of my overall score, but I think that he's one of those guys that, again, my score is high enough where that if he gets the draft capital and he gets the opportunity, he's going to move up in my post-draft ranking. So I liked Pierce. Kennedy Brooks, I just want to end this and say, finish what we were about to talk about with him and put an endpoint on Brooks, is that if I could go to Vegas and put a prop bet on who's the 2022 running back who could have a Terrell Davis-like surprising career, I would put my money on Kennedy Brooks. He is the most technically sound running back I have seen in this class. His ability to make the small movements, those little micro movements that Jay Moyer and I talk about a lot, to avoid full-on contact, and his contact balance is really a strength of his game. And I know DeMarco Murray. I remember interviewing him at the Senior Bowl when he was a prospect, and when DeMarco Murray makes comments about he's coaching Oklahoma backs, he's like, listen, we couldn't get him off the field. We had better athletes. We couldn't get him off the field. He just kept getting yards. He kept doing it. The thing is that Kennedy Brooks understands how to read boxes pre-snap, understand where the rushing lanes are likely to be, and make his cutback decisions pre-snap based on late pre-snap, early post-snap information. And you don't see a lot of backs at this level do that. Even as a junior, he was doing that. And he was one of my top 5 backs last year if he had come out. So I'm a big fan of his. Keontae Ingram's interesting to me because I'm a big fan of his. There's a lot of Chris Ivory, Kareem Hunt kind of style of running to him. He's more along that Marshawn Lynch scale to me than Dameon Pierce is. But and I like that he can catch. His blocking's not great, but he's a very versatile runner. He's very low, relative to the other backs on this one. But this is probably where his draft capital is going to be. I mean, I had no issues with that, but it is fascinating to look at that guy.
Yeah. He checks some boxes, like with the weight, his, at 221 pounds, the 1.53 10-yard split was very good in wide zone. Was not as good in some of the other run concepts, but like this last tier are players that have shown an ability to make explosive plays, but they just didn't completely take over a backfield. But again, to your point, like there are going to be a lot of reasons for that. It could be level of competition, all those sort of things. But yeah, he hits that 17% mark on a career explosive rush rate. I did notice with him, like I mentioned, really most of it came in wide zone. Like he was really good in that. So if he could land in a scheme like that, I think that would be nice. But that's the tier. Explosive playmakers who didn't ultimately take over their backfields in college. And so but we'll see what happens with the draft capital. All of a sudden you see Keontae Ingram, land in a scheme that we know runs wide zone and he gets a 5th round pick. like he's a guy I'll be stashing in dynasty leagues.
Who stands out to you that we didn't talk about that just for whatever reason?
Okay, let me look back at it here. Well, I mean, I hate to go back like just, to the top, but
It's all right.
Isaiah Spiller, like, is just one for me. Like it's, he was productive early in his career. He'll be the youngest back in his rookie season, 21.1 years old. He's got the weight, he's got all these things. But then he came out, he ran slow. His explosive rush rate, though, doesn't suggest that he's slow, right? 16%, is one of the better marks on the page. You can see here, not as good on the avoided tackles per attempt, but like if I was also to show in here like his best season as far as his avoided tackles per attempt, like last year, I want to say he got close to the 30% mark as a junior. But when I watch him, it's like, I don't not like it, but I'm also like, it's like, okay, he seems nice, but it's like I struggle to find anything special, with his game. And then with his draft capital starting to sink, I know he can catch passes. Like that's one thing I definitely saw with him, and I like that. And obviously for fantasy, especially if you're playing a PPR league, like, look, you got a young back that's shown they're explosive and they can catch passes. Like you really don't have to say much more than that from fantasy standpoint. But we just love your thoughts on what you see with Spiller, on the film and where you have it.
He grew on me, and I had him number 3 overall on my board as well, and he was at the bottom of my first tier. So essentially tier 2, but it looks identical to this, other than I just have him at the bottom of the first tier. The things that I like about him: excellent footwork. Very refined footwork in terms of understanding how to use different footwork styles that are efficient. Unlike a Kenyon Drake, who I've always talked about as the model of the guy who will take 4 yards to make a cut that he could have done in one step. Very Adrian Peterson-like in that respect, but couldn't get away with it like Peterson. Spiller's the type of guy that understands how to be able to make the efficient movement. And that's where I think a lot of people mess up, as they look at the Anthony McFarlands and the Kenyon Drakes of the world and see the dynamic movement and don't understand the context and scope of when to be efficient and how to do that. Like they need to watch Frank Gore tape. And then, he also has some issues with plays where he tries to bounce them outside on gap plays, that he has a lane that he should set up and follow that pulling block and really manipulate that. And as Jay Moyer had mentioned when he saw one of my clips of that, said, man, I would have, anybody in my high school league would have benched a kid for some of the decisions that he made on plays like that. And that's true, but he's a very good outside zone runner. He's probably going to play wide zone. So you don't have to worry about him running these gap plays like that. And he's probably not going to keep making mistakes like that on gap plays. He is a student of the game. I think he'll continue learning. The biggest thing I'd like to see him improve from a power standpoint is that there are times in the open field that he forgets that he needs to have his hips aligned with his pads in the same direction that he's moving, because sometimes he'll try and make a move while he's trying to, or he's like caught in mid thought on how to, like, when to lower the pads on a defender who's much smaller than him, and he gets driven backwards when he has a running start because his hips aren't aligned downhill when he's trying to drop his pads on a guy. So he has to, there's some minor things that he has to work on. But, to me, if the Bills decide to go wide zone, and they couldn't get Hall or Walker and they wanted to take a chance on a guy like Spiller, I'd be happy with that.
They've had him for a visit. So
yeah.
There's been several teams that have had Spiller for a visit, whether it's virtual or a private visit since the combine. So, I think there's definitely interest in him. There was even a piece, Doug Kyatt from PFF put out earlier this week where he just interviewed a lot of different, executives, across the NFL, like who are the guys that, maybe, I don't want to call it fantasy Twitter because that's not what he cares about, but that's what I immediately think of. But basically the masses are probably lower on, or they've started to slide down boards that really the NFL teams are not, right? Yeah. And they're still, they still like them. And Isaiah Spiller was one of the first names that came up, is that the teams are still, I think they're still comfortable, with him. So I think he's probably still going to end up maybe as a late second. If not, I think he ends up being a third round pick.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, without a doubt, this was great. Wish we had more time, but we take what we can get and what we can squeeze in. But you can find Dwain McFarland at Pro Football Focus, and of course his Twitter handle Dwain McFarland. You can find me at Matt Waldman. Again, take a look at that. GoFundMe if you have an opportunity. And of course, the rookie scouting portfolio is available for download. You can get it at mattwaldman.com. And I do have the pre-draft, post-draft package, as well as the projections, dynasty rankings package. They are separate things. You don't get the book with both of them. You get the books with the $21.95 product. You get the dynasty rankings and projections with the $24.95 product. Together, you get a really nice, well-rounded fantasy product for you. If you're a draftnik, then the rookie and just focus on rookie drafts, as well as your redraft looks at wanting to have a longer-term look at players. I'd say get the pre-draft, post-draft package. That's probably going to be your good way to go. And thanks again for listening. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and see you next week.